He said I was too much to love. So I left without a word and sent him my wedding invitation a month later. You're just too much, Vivian. Too intense, too emotional, too everything. I can't breathe around you anymore. Those words didn't just hit me. They demolished me. I stood frozen in the doorway of our shared apartment, my work bag still slung over my shoulder, keys dangling from my trembling fingers. The familiar scent of our home, vanilla candles and Ryan's cologne, suddenly felt suffocating. The man I'd loved for 3 years, the man I'd built my entire future around, had just reduced me to a burden he could no longer carry. My name is Vivian Cooper. I'm 29 years old, and until that devastating Tuesday evening in September, I thought I knew exactly who I was and where my life was heading. I was the senior marketing coordinator at Patterson Associates, the woman who could turn any brand campaign into pure gold, the girlfriend who remembered every anniversary and planned surprise parties that people talked about for months. I was living in a beautiful apartment in Capitol Hill, Seattle, with floor-to-ceiling windows that captured the sunrise perfectly, and a man who I believed saw my passion as a gift, not a curse. But apparently, I was wrong about everything. Ryan sat hunched over his MacBook at our dining table, the same table where we'd shared countless meals, where he'd helped me practice presentations for work, where we'd spent entire Sunday mornings reading the newspaper and planning our weekends. His dark hair fell across his forehead the way it always did when he was concentrating. But there was something different about his posture, something final and cold that made my stomach clench with dread. "What do you mean, too much?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I was still wearing my favorite emerald green blazer, the one he'd complimented just that morning when I'd kissed him goodbye. Now I felt ridiculous in it, like I was dressed up for a party no one had told me was canceled. Ryan finally looked up, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not anger, not sadness, but a kind of weary resignation that was somehow worse than either. "You plan everything to death, Vivian. Every weekend, every vacation, every dinner has to be an event. You get excited about the most mundane things. Yesterday, you spent 20 minutes telling me about a new coffee shop like it was the discovery of the century." I remembered that conversation. I'd been so excited about the little cafe I'd found near my office, with its exposed brick walls and the owner who remembered everyone's names. I'd thought Ryan was listening, really listening, the way he used to when we first started dating. "You want to talk about feelings constantly," he continued, his voice gaining momentum like he'd been rehearsing this speech. "Every little thing becomes a deep conversation about our relationship, our future, our feelings. It's exhausting, Vivian. Normal people don't live life at your intensity level." Each word felt like a small knife, carefully placed to cause maximum damage. I thought about all the times I'd tried to talk to him about my day, about my dreams, about the way I felt when I watched him sleep in the morning light. I'd thought those conversations were what made us close. I'd thought he valued my emotional honesty. "I thought you loved that about me," I managed to say, my voice cracking on the last word. "I thought I did too," he replied, already turning back to his screen. "But I've realized I need someone more balanced. Someone who doesn't turn every moment into a production. Someone who can just exist without needing everything to be meaningful or special or perfect." The apartment we'd so carefully built together suddenly felt like a museum of my own delusions. The gallery wall of photos from trips, Portland, Vancouver, the San Juan Islands, now seemed like evidence of my own desperate attempts to create meaning where none existed. The bookshelf we'd assembled on a rainy Sunday last winter, laughing as we argued over the instructions, felt like a monument to my naivety. The throw pillows I'd chosen because they reminded me of sunset colors, the plants I'd nursed back to health, the carefully curated collection of vintage cookbooks. Everything screamed of someone trying too hard to make a house feel like a home. I walked slowly to our bedroom, each step feeling like I was walking through quicksand. The room was exactly as I'd left it that morning. My jewelry scattered across the dresser, the book I was reading face down on my nightstand, the sweater I'd tried on and discarded draped over the chair. Evidence of a life I'd thought was secure, permanent, real. I pulled my largest suitcase from the closet and began packing mechanically. 3 years of sharing a life with someone. It's amazing how quickly it can be condensed into luggage. I folded my clothes with the same careful attention I always gave to packing, even though my hands were shaking and tears were streaming down my face. Some habits are too ingrained to break, even in the middle of heartbreak. My professional wardrobe went in first, the blazers and pencil skirts that made me feel powerful and competent. Then my casual clothes, the jeans and sweaters that Ryan used to say looked beautiful on me. My workout gear, though I couldn't imagine ever having the energy to exercise again. The vintage band t-shirts I'd collected over the years, each one tied to a memory of concerts and late-night record shopping trips. From the dresser, I gathered my jewelry, the delicate gold necklace my grandmother had given me, the vintage earrings I'd found at Pike Place Market, the simple silver bracelet Ryan had given me for our first anniversary. I hesitated over that last one before dropping it into my jewelry box with a clattering sound that felt inappropriately loud in the silent apartment. My books were harder. I'd always been a voracious reader, and our shelves were a mix of my novels and poetry collections and Ryan's business books and tech magazines. I took only my favorites, the worn copy of The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo that I'd read 6 times, my collection of Maya Angelou poetry, the marketing strategy books that had shaped my career. Everything else would have to stay, like pieces of myself I was being forced to abandon. The bathroom was a minefield of shared spaces, our toothbrushes side by side, his shaving cream next to my face wash, the towels we'd bought together in soft gray because we'd both loved how they felt. I packed only what was definitively mine, leaving gaps on the shelves that looked like missing teeth. Through it all, Ryan never came to check on me, never asked if I needed help, never tried to take back the words that had just destroyed our relationship. I could hear him in the living room, the quiet clicking of his keyboard, the sound of him continuing his life as if nothing had changed. By the time I finished packing, it was nearly midnight. 3 years of my life fit into 2 large suitcases, a box of books, and a bag of miscellaneous items I couldn't bear to leave behind. As I loaded everything into my Honda Civic, I felt like I was conducting my own funeral, carrying pieces of my former self to some unknown burial ground. The drive to my friend Sarah's apartment in Fremont was a blur of streetlights and stop signs. Seattle at night had always felt magical to me. The way the city lights reflected off Elliott Bay, the Space Needle standing sentinel over everything, the sense that anything was possible in a city that seemed to exist in constant motion. But that night, it all felt hostile and foreign, like I was seeing it through the eyes of a stranger. Sarah lived in a 1920s apartment building with character and charm. Exposed brick walls, hardwood floors that creaked in all the right places, and windows that let in perfect morning light. She'd been my best friend since our freshman year at University of Washington, and in all the years I'd known her, I'd never seen her look as fierce as she did when she opened her door at 12:30 a.m. and saw my tear-stained face and pile of luggage. "What did that asshole do?" she asked, stepping aside to let me in without waiting for an explanation. Her apartment was exactly what you'd expect from Sarah, eclectic and warm, with mismatched furniture that somehow worked perfectly together, plants thriving in every corner, and bookshelves that overflowed with everything from classic literature to trashy romance novels. The walls were covered with her own photography and artwork from local artists, creating a space that felt alive and creative and completely authentic. I collapsed onto her vintage velvet sofa, still wearing my work clothes, and the whole story came pouring out between sobs. Sarah listened without interrupting, her face growing more thunderous with each detail I shared. When I finished, she handed me a box of tissues and a glass of wine that appeared as if by magic. "He's an idiot," Sarah said flatly, settling into the armchair across from me. "Your intensity is what makes you incredible at your job. It's why you got that promotion last month, beating out people with twice your experience. It's why you throw birthday parties that people remember for years. Why you remember everyone's coffee orders and their kids' names and their anniversary dates. It's why you cry during commercials about shelter dogs finding families, and why you spent your entire Saturday helping Mrs. Chen from downstairs organize her closet." I took a shaky sip of wine, a beautiful Pinot Noir that Sarah had been saving for a special occasion. "But maybe he's right," I said, staring into the deep red liquid. "Maybe I'm too much. Maybe I do make everything more complicated than it needs to be." "For him? Absolutely. And thank God for that." Sarah's voice was fierce with loyalty. "Vivienne, I've watched you in relationships before Ryan, and I've watched you with Ryan. You dimmed yourself for him. You started apologizing for your enthusiasm, second-guessing your instincts, turning down the volume on everything that makes you who you are. And he still had the audacity to call you too much." That hit me like a physical blow because I knew she was right. Over the past year, I had started editing myself around Ryan. When I got excited about a new project at work, I'd catch myself and try to tone it down. When I wanted to plan elaborate date nights, I'd settle for Netflix and takeout instead. When I felt the urge to have deep conversations about our relationship, I'd swallow the words and pretend everything was fine. "You know what the worst part is?" I said, setting down my wine glass harder than necessary. "I thought I was being considerate. I thought I was learning to be more balanced, more mature. I thought I was becoming a better girlfriend." "You were becoming a smaller version of yourself," Sarah said gently. "And that's not the same thing at all." I spent the next week living in Sarah's spare room, which she'd turned into a cozy guest space with a daybed covered in soft blankets and fairy lights strung around the window. Every morning, I'd wake up disoriented, expecting to see Ryan's side of the bed, expecting to smell coffee brewing in our kitchen. Instead, I'd find notes from Sarah, little encouragements written on colorful sticky notes and left on my bedside table. Work became my refuge. At Patterson Associates, I was still the Vivienne who could turn a failing campaign into a success story, who could see connections and opportunities that others missed. My colleagues knew something was wrong. I'd stopped bringing homemade cookies to Monday meetings, stopped organizing happy hours, stopped being the social glue that held our team together, but they were kind enough not to pry. My boss, Janet Patterson herself, called me into her office on Thursday. "Vivienne, I don't know what's going on in your personal life, and you don't have to tell me," she said, her voice warm but direct. "But I want you to know that your work hasn't suffered. If anything, that campaign you presented for the Morrison account on Tuesday was some of the best strategic thinking I've seen in years. Whatever you're going through, don't let it make you doubt your professional worth." I nearly cried right there in her office. At least at work, I was still valued for the very qualities that Ryan had found overwhelming. Ryan texted me exactly twice that week. The first time was Wednesday. "Did you take my phone charger by mistake?" The second was Friday. "You got some mail, should I forward it?" No apology, no acknowledgement that he'd just ended 3 years of our lives, no sign that he was affected by my absence at all. I didn't respond to either message. Friday evening, I was walking back to Sarah's apartment from the grocery store when I passed Victrola Coffee on Capitol Hill, the same cafe where Ryan and I had our first date 3.5 years ago. I'd been carrying bags of ingredients for dinner, planning to cook for Sarah as a small thank you for her hospitality, when I glanced through the large windows and saw him. Ryan was sitting at our old table, the one in the corner by the window where we used to sit for hours, talking about everything and nothing. But he wasn't alone. A woman sat across from him, blonde and effortlessly beautiful, in that way some people just are. She was wearing a simple cream sweater and dark jeans, her hair falling in perfect waves around her shoulders. She looked calm, composed. Exactly the kind of person who would never be accused of being too much. I watched them for a moment, feeling like a ghost observing the living. She didn't gesture wildly when she talked the way I did. She didn't lean forward with excitement or touch his arm when making a point. She didn't seem to be passionate about anything they were discussing. Just pleasantly engaged, appropriately interested, perfectly balanced. Ryan was smiling at her in a way I recognized, but hadn't seen directed at me in months. It was the smile he used to give me when we first started dating, when my enthusiasm was charming instead of exhausting, when my intensity was intriguing instead of overwhelming. Standing there on the sidewalk, holding bags of groceries and watching my ex-boyfriend flirt with my replacement, I expected to feel devastated. Instead, I felt something unexpected. Clarity. This woman, calm, measured, appropriately enthusiastic about life. This was what Ryan had wanted all along. Not a toned-down version of me, but someone fundamentally different. Someone who would never need to be asked to dim her light because her light was already the exact wattage he preferred. And in that moment, I realized something profound. I didn't want to be her. I didn't want to be someone who felt things in moderation, who approached life with careful restraint, who never got too excited or too sad or too anything. I wanted to be me, the full, intense, overwhelming version of myself. I just needed to find someone who wanted that too. I pulled out my phone and texted Sarah, "I need you to set me up with that photographer from your yoga class, the one you keep saying I should meet. Tonight if possible." Her response was immediate. "Finally, his name is David and he's free for dinner. Sending you his number now." David Cooper. No relation despite the shared surname. Agreed to meet me at a small Italian restaurant in Ballard with only 2 hours' notice. He suggested the place, describing it as tiny and chaotic and absolutely perfect, which already seemed like a good sign. I almost canceled 3 times while getting ready. What was I doing, going on a date less than 2 weeks after the end of a 3-year relationship? But every time I reached for my phone to back out, I remembered the image of Ryan and his perfectly composed blonde, and I forced myself to follow through. The restaurant was exactly as David had described, cramped and loud and bustling with energy. The kind of place Ryan would have hated because you couldn't have a quiet conversation, where the servers were more focused on the food than the service, where everything felt slightly chaotic and completely authentic. David was already waiting when I arrived, and I recognized him immediately from Sarah's Instagram photos. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that looked like he'd been running his fingers through it, wearing a navy button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and jeans that had clearly seen better days. He had the kind of the face that was interesting rather than conventionally handsome. Strong jaw, expressive dark eyes, laugh lines that suggested he smiled often. "Vivienne?" He stood up as I approached, and his smile was warm and genuine. "I have to admit, when Sarah described you, I was expecting someone completely different." "Different how?" I asked, settling into the chair across from him. "She made you sound like this force of nature, this incredibly passionate person who attacks life with enthusiasm. But you seem..." He paused, studying my face. "Subdued. Like you're holding yourself back." I was startled by his perceptiveness. We'd been talking for less than 5 minutes, and he'd already seen something that Ryan had missed for months. "I'm recovering from being told I was too much," I said honestly. "I'm not sure how to be the right amount anymore." David's expression shifted, becoming more serious. "Too much for who?" "My ex-boyfriend. He said I was too intense, too emotional, too everything." "And you believed him?" The question caught me off guard. Shouldn't I have? David leaned back in his chair, considering his words carefully. "Let me tell you something about being too much. Last month, I spent 6 hours driving to the Olympic Peninsula because I'd seen a photo of this waterfall online and I had to capture it at golden hour. I got there and hiked for 2 hours in the rain, waited another 3 hours for the light to be perfect, and took maybe 20 shots of the same waterfall. My friends think I'm crazy. My family thinks I'm obsessed. But when I got that perfect shot, the one where the light hits the water just right and you can see every droplet suspended in the air, it was worth every second. He pulled out his phone and showed me the photo. It was breathtaking, ethereal and powerful at the same time. The kind of image that makes you stop scrolling and just stare. That's what passion looks like, he said. That's what happens when you care about something so much that other people think you're crazy. The right people don't call that too much. They call it inspiring. Our conversation flowed from there like we'd known each other for years. David told me about his work as a freelance photographer, specializing in landscapes and nature photography. He'd quit his corporate job 2 years ago to pursue his passion full-time, a decision that his family still didn't understand, but that had made him happier than he'd ever been. I found myself telling him about my work at the marketing firm, about the campaigns I developed, and the clients I'd helped transform their brands. For the first time in weeks, I felt excited talking about my career, gesturing with my hands as I described a particularly challenging project. "You light up when you talk about your work," David observed. "It's beautiful to watch." I almost started crying right there in the crowded restaurant. We talked about everything: our families, our friends, our dreams for the future. David had grown up in a small town in eastern Washington, the youngest of 4 kids in a family that valued practicality over passion. His decision to become a photographer had been met with concern and subtle disapproval, but he'd persevered because he couldn't imagine doing anything else. "My mom still asks when I'm going to get a real job," he said with a laugh. "She doesn't understand that taking pictures isn't just what I do for money, it's who I am." I understood that feeling completely. Marketing wasn't just my career, it was my way of seeing the world, of finding connections and stories in everything around me. When the waiter brought our entrees, David asked about my relationship with Ryan. I found myself telling him the whole story: how we'd met in college, how we'd built what I thought was a solid relationship, how he'd slowly grown tired of my enthusiasm and intensity. "He sounds like someone who fell in love with the idea of you but couldn't handle the reality of you," David said thoughtfully. "That's not your fault, Vivian. That's his limitation, not your flaw." Our first date lasted 4 hours. We closed down the restaurant, talking long after we'd finished eating, neither of us wanting the evening to end. When David walked me to my car, he didn't try to kiss me or push for another date. Instead, he said, "I'd really like to see you again, but only if you promise to be yourself, the real unedited version, the one your ex-boyfriend was too small to appreciate." I went home to Sarah's apartment feeling lighter than I had in months. Our second date was a hiking trip to Snoqualmie Falls. David brought his camera equipment, and I watched him work, fascinated by his process. He didn't just point and shoot, he studied the light, considered different angles, waited patiently for the perfect moment. His passion for his craft was obvious in every movement, every decision. "Can I take some pictures of you?" he asked as we sat on a rock overlooking the waterfall. I protested automatically. I looked terrible after hiking. My hair was messy from the wind, I wasn't wearing makeup. But David insisted, and I found myself relaxing as he worked, laughing at his commentary and forgetting to be self-conscious. When he showed me the images on his camera's display, I was stunned. I looked alive in a way I hadn't seen in months. My hair was wild from the wind, my cheeks were flushed from exertion, and I was mid-laugh at something he'd said. I looked like myself again, the real version, not the careful, edited version I'd become with Ryan. "You're not too much," David said quietly, as if reading my thoughts. "You're exactly enough." 3 weeks into dating David, I realized I hadn't thought about Ryan in days. Not because I was trying to forget him, but because I was too busy being happy to dwell on the past. David and I had fallen into an easy rhythm that felt natural and right. Morning coffee dates before work, where we'd sit in companionable silence reading the news and sharing interesting articles. Evening walks around Green Lake, talking about our days and making plans for the weekend. Lazy Sunday mornings in his apartment in Ballard, where he'd make elaborate breakfasts while I graded student papers from the marketing workshop I taught part-time at the community college. David's apartment was a perfect reflection of who he was, a converted warehouse space with exposed brick walls and enormous windows that let in incredible natural light. His photography covered every wall, and he had a darkroom set up in what used to be a closet. The space felt creative and alive, filled with plants and books and cameras in various states of repair. It was during one of our weekend adventures, a camping trip to Mount Rainier, that David told me he was falling in love with me. We'd spent the day hiking to Tolmy Peak, where David had taken some of his most stunning landscape shots. I'd brought my laptop and worked on a campaign proposal while he photographed the mountain from every possible angle. As the sun set, we'd set up our campsite and built a fire, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. I'd been telling him about my childhood dreams of becoming an astronaut, complete with dramatic reenactments of rocket launches and spacewalks. Most people found my tendency toward theatrical storytelling annoying, but David was laughing so hard he nearly fell off his camping chair. "I love how you dream big," he said suddenly, his voice becoming serious. "I love how you throw yourself into everything completely. I love that you cry during movies, and that you remember everyone's birthdays and that you plan things months in advance because you get so excited about them." My heart stopped. "David, I know we haven't been dating long," he continued, "but I've never felt this way about anyone. You make me want to be more adventurous, more open, more passionate about everything. You don't make me want to be less of myself. You make me want to be more." I kissed him under the canopy of stars, tasting wine and possibility and a future I hadn't dared to imagine just a month ago. 2 months later, David proposed. It wasn't a grand gesture or elaborate plan, but a perfect moment that captured exactly who we were together. I was making coffee in his kitchen on a Tuesday morning, wearing one of his old college t-shirts and singing off-key to the radio. I'd spent the night at his place and was getting ready for work, dancing around his kitchen while waiting for the coffee to brew. He appeared in the doorway with a small velvet box, looking nervous and hopeful and absolutely perfect. "I know this is crazy fast," he said, "but I can't imagine my life without your beautiful chaos in it. Will you marry me?" I said yes before he finished the question. The ring was perfect. A simple solitaire setting with a stone that caught the light beautifully, elegant but not flashy. It was exactly what I would have chosen if I'd been shopping for myself, which made me realize how well David understood me, how carefully he'd been paying attention to my preferences and style. We decided to have a short engagement, 6 weeks from proposal to wedding. Not because we were in a rush, but because when you know something is right, why wait? The decision sent both our families into mild panic attacks, but David's calm confidence reassured everyone that this wasn't some rebound romance or impulsive decision. "When you know, he told my worried parents over dinner, "and I know Vivienne is the love of my life." Planning the wedding became everything Ryan would have hated and everything that made me feel most like myself. I threw myself into every detail with the intensity that had once been called overwhelming. I researched venues obsessively, created color-coded spreadsheets for vendors, and changed my mind about the flowers 3 times before settling on a mix of wildflowers and garden roses that would look beautiful, but not too formal. David loved every minute of it. "Show me the cake options again," he'd say when I apologized for being indecisive. I want to hear why you've decided the lavender lemon cake represents our relationship better than the vanilla bean. He accompanied me to every vendor meeting, sat through hours of menu tastings without complaint, and never once suggested I was being excessive or overwhelming. When I wanted to write our own vows, he bought us matching journals and spent hours crafting words that made me cry happy tears. When I decided we needed a photo booth with props, he spent an entire weekend helping me make signs and gathering silly accessories from thrift stores around the city. 3 weeks before the wedding, as I was addressing invitations in my careful calligraphy, David looked over my shoulder at the guest list spread across his dining table. "Are you inviting Ryan?" he asked casually. I paused, pen hovering over an envelope. I hadn't even considered it. "Should I?" "It's entirely your choice," he said, grinning with just a hint of mischief. "But it would be pretty satisfying, wouldn't it? Showing him what he missed out on?" The idea took root immediately. Not out of spite exactly, but out of a desire for closure. For proof that his assessment of me had been spectacularly wrong, that I wasn't too much for the right person. I was exactly what the right person had been looking for. I found Ryan's address online. He'd moved to a new apartment in Belltown, probably with the calm blonde from the coffee shop, and wrote out an invitation in my most elegant handwriting. The invitation itself was beautiful, printed on heavy cream cardstock with gold foil accents, exactly the kind of thing Ryan would have called unnecessarily fancy. Inside, I included one of our engagement photos, David and me laughing on a beach at sunset, looking ridiculously happy and completely ourselves. We looked like people who had found their perfect match, who brought out the best in each other, rather than asking the other to be less. On the back of the photo, I wrote in my careful script, "Thank you for teaching me that I deserved someone who would love all of me, Vivienne." I mailed it on a Tuesday, exactly 3 months after Ryan had called me too much and changed the entire trajectory of my life. The wedding was perfect in all the imperfect ways that mattered most. It rained during the ceremony, so we moved everything inside the venue, a restored warehouse in Georgetown with exposed brick walls and industrial lighting that created the most romantic atmosphere. The intimate setting made everything feel more personal, more meaningful. My cousin's toddler had a complete meltdown during the vows, and David incorporated the crying into his speech about how love means accepting chaos and finding beauty in the unexpected moments. The caterer forgot to prepare the vegetarian option, so my vegetarian guests ended up with an impromptu pasta bar that became the hit of the reception. Every single thing that would have stressed me out beyond belief with Ryan felt like just another beautiful part of our story with David. When the flowers arrived and they were slightly different than what I'd ordered, David helped me rearrange them into something even more beautiful. When the musician's microphone cut out, David led everyone in an impromptu sing-along. When my dress got caught on a nail and tore slightly, David's sister pinned it up with a vintage brooch that ended up looking intentional and perfect. I was dancing with my new husband when Sarah appeared at my elbow with a knowing smile and her phone in her hand. "You need to see this," she said, showing me a text thread. It was from her friend Melissa, who worked at the same company as Ryan's new girlfriend. "OMG, you guys, Ryan got an invitation to his ex's wedding and he's been a complete mess for 3 days. Jessica is furious because he keeps talking about Vivienne and how maybe he made a mistake. She's threatening to break up with him if he doesn't get over it. He's been carrying around the wedding invitation like it's some kind of talisman. It's honestly pathetic." I looked at David, who was spinning me around the dance floor with complete joy, his face lit up with happiness and love, and felt nothing but gratitude. Gratitude that Ryan had been wrong about me. Gratitude that his rejection had led me to someone who celebrated everything he'd found overwhelming. Gratitude that I'd learned the profound difference between being too much for the wrong person and being exactly enough for the right one. Poor Jessica, I said to Sarah, and I meant it sincerely. She deserves better than someone who's still hung up on his ex. As David dipped me dramatically during our first dance, making me laugh so hard I snorted ungracefully, I caught sight of our wedding photographer capturing the moment. Later, when we saw the photos, that picture became my absolute favorite. Me mid-laugh, completely unself-conscious and radiantly happy, while David looked at me like I was the most wonderful thing he'd ever seen. That became the photo we used for our Christmas cards that year, along with a message that read, "Wishing you love that celebrates every part of who you are." We sent one to Ryan's old address, just in case he hadn't moved in with Jessica yet. 6 months after the wedding, Sarah ran into Ryan at Elliott Bay Book Company in Capitol Hill. He was alone, looking tired and older than his 31 years, browsing the self-help section with the kind of desperate focus that suggested he was searching for answers to questions he couldn't articulate. "How's Vivian?" he asked immediately, not even bothering with small talk. "Blissfully happy," Sarah replied without hesitation. "Married to someone who thinks her intensity is the best thing about her." "I saw the wedding photos on social media," Ryan said quietly. "She looked radiant. Different than I remember." "Not different," Sarah corrected firmly. "Just loved properly for the first time in years." Ryan nodded slowly, understanding finally dawning in his eyes. "I messed up, didn't I? I mean, really, spectacularly messed up." "Beyond spectacularly," Sarah agreed. "But it worked out exactly as it should have. She found someone who deserves her, and well, you learned a valuable lesson about not trying to change someone you claim to love." "Is she happy?" Ryan asked, his voice almost pleading. "Happier than I've ever seen her. She's planning elaborate anniversary trips and taking photography classes and laughing until she cried at least once a week. She's herself again, fully and completely." That evening, Sarah called to tell me about the encounter, her voice filled with satisfaction. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if he'd fought for you?" she asked. "If he'd realized his mistake before you met David?" I was curled up on our couch, David's and mine now, watching him edit photos on his laptop while a cooking show played in the background. He'd pause occasionally to show me a particularly beautiful shot from his latest landscape series, his eyes lighting up as he explained the lighting or composition or the story behind the image. "No," I said honestly, running my fingers through David's hair as he worked. "Because someone who could call me too much and mean it as an insult was never going to be my person. David doesn't tolerate my intensity. He treasures it. He doesn't put up with my passion. He's inspired by it. There's a world of difference. And that difference is everything," Sarah said. A year later, an elegant wedding invitation arrived in our mailbox. Ryan was marrying Jessica, the calm blonde from the coffee shop. The invitation was beautiful but generic, the kind you could order from any online service with standard wording and predictable fonts. David found me staring at it in our kitchen, which we'd renovated to include a breakfast nook where we spent our mornings drinking coffee and planning our days. "Are we going?" he asked, wrapping his arms around me from behind. "I don't think so," I said, leaning back against his chest. "That chapter is completely closed." "Good," he said, kissing the top of my head. "Because I was hoping we could use that weekend to scout locations for our anniversary trip." I turned in his arms, already getting excited about the possibilities. "Where were you thinking?" "Surprise me," he said, grinning. "Plan something elaborate and over the top and completely you. I can't wait to see what your beautiful mind comes up with." As I started mentally cataloging romantic destinations and anniversary activities, feeling that familiar surge of enthusiasm that Ryan had once found exhausting, David's eyes lit up as he watched me get lost in planning mode. I realized again how profound the difference was between someone who loved you despite your quirks and someone who loved you because of them. That night, as we lay in bed discussing potential anniversary destinations, Iceland for the northern lights, New Zealand for the landscapes, Italy for the food and art, David traced lazy patterns on my arm in the darkness. "I have a confession," he said softly. "What's that?" "I'm grateful to Ryan." I shifted in the darkness to face him, surprised. "Grateful? Why?" "Because his inability to love you properly led you to me. If he'd been smart enough to appreciate what he had, if he'd been secure enough to celebrate your passion instead of diminishing it, you never would have been single when Sarah introduced us." I felt tears prick my eyes in the darkness. "That's a beautiful way to look at it." "It's the only way to look at it," David said, his voice warm with certainty. "Every painful moment you went through, every time he made you feel like you were too much, was leading you to someone who would recognize that you're actually just enough. Perfect. Exactly as you are. I love you," I whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," he replied, pulling me closer. "Every overwhelming, passionate, intense, beautiful part of you." 2 years later, I was promoted to creative director at Patterson Associates. The day I got the news, I called David immediately, practically vibrating with excitement as I told him about my new role, my expanded responsibilities, the creative freedom I'd been given. "I'm so proud of you," he said, and I could hear the genuine joy in his voice. "We have to celebrate. Dinner at that new restaurant you've been wanting to try? The one with the tasting menu? Are you sure? It's probably going to be a 3-hour dinner with multiple courses and wine pairings." "Vivian," he interrupted gently, "stop apologizing for wanting to celebrate your success properly. You got a huge promotion. You deserve to make it an event." That evening, as we sat through a 7-course tasting menu, I told David about my plans for the creative department, my vision for the campaigns we could develop, the innovative approaches I wanted to implement. He listened to every word, asked thoughtful questions, celebrated each idea with the same enthusiasm I brought to it. "You know what I love most about your success?" he said as we shared a decadent chocolate dessert. "It's not just that you're brilliant at what you do, it's that you're brilliant at it in your own way. You didn't have to become someone else to succeed. You just had to find the right place for your particular kind of genius." 3 months later, Sarah called me with news that made my day. "Remember Melissa from Ryan's office?" she said without preamble. "She just told me the most delicious gossip." "I'm listening," I said, settling into my favorite reading chair in our living room. "Ryan and Jessica are getting divorced. Apparently, he's been impossible to live with ever since they got married. Melissa says he's become obsessed with the idea that he made the biggest mistake of his life by letting you go. Jessica finally had enough and filed for divorce last month." I felt a pang of sympathy for Jessica, but nothing more than that. "That's sad," I said, and meant it. "She deserves someone who's completely present in their relationship." "The best part," Sarah continued, clearly relishing the story, "is that he's been telling everyone who will listen that he's learned his lesson about trying to change someone. He's apparently doing therapy and reading self-help books about accepting your partner as they are." "Good for him," I said. "Maybe he'll be better for the next person." "You're not even a little bit vindicated?" I considered the question as I looked around our living room. David had built floor-to-ceiling bookshelves to hold our combined collection of books, photography equipment, and travel souvenirs. The walls were covered with his landscape photography and my collection of vintage advertising posters. Plants thrived in every corner, and fairy lights I'd strung around the windows cast a warm glow over everything. It was a space that perfectly reflected both of our personalities, a home where neither of us had to diminish ourselves to fit. "I feel sorry for him," I said finally. "It must be terrible to realize you gave up something wonderful because you were too scared to let yourself be changed by it." That weekend, David and I drove to the Oregon coast for a photography workshop he'd been wanting to attend. As I watched him work with the other photographers, sharing techniques and discussing the interplay of light and shadow, I was struck again by how much I loved watching him pursue his passion. His dedication to his craft, his willingness to wake up at 4 a.m. to catch perfect lighting conditions, his patient pursuit of the ideal shot. It was everything Ryan had called too much in me, and it was exactly what I found most attractive about David. During a break in the workshop, David and I walked along the beach, collecting interesting shells and talking about our plans for the coming year. He wanted to put together a gallery show of his landscape work. I was developing a new campaign strategy that I was excited to present to our biggest client. "Can I ask you something?" David said, stopping to photograph a piece of driftwood that had caught his eye. "Do you ever miss the simplicity of your relationship with Ryan? The way he wanted everything to be calm and predictable?" I thought about it seriously as I watched him work, considering different angles and waiting for the light to shift. "You know what I miss?" I said finally. "I miss the version of myself I was before I started dimming my light for someone else. But I don't miss the relationship itself. Simple isn't always better, David. Sometimes it's just less." "And you don't want less anymore?" "I want everything," I said, gesturing toward the dramatic coastline, the crashing waves, the endless sky. "I want to feel everything deeply, experience everything fully. I want to plan elaborate adventures and cry at beautiful sunsets and get excited about small discoveries. I want a life that's rich and complex and sometimes chaotic. Even if it's overwhelming sometimes." "Especially then," I said, taking his hand. "Because overwhelming with the right person feels like abundance, not burden." That evening, as we sat in our cozy bed and breakfast watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors, I got a text from an unknown number. The message was simple. "Congratulations on your promotion. You deserve every success. R." I showed David the message, and he raised an eyebrow. "How did he get your number?" "Probably from someone at my old workplace," I said, deleting the message without responding. "It doesn't matter. Are you okay?" David asked, studying my face. "I'm perfect," I said, and realized I meant it completely. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, with exactly who I'm supposed to be with. 5 years after that devastating conversation in our Capitol Hill apartment, I was packing for another trip. This time, an anniversary celebration David had planned as a surprise. He'd been secretive about the details, only telling me to pack for adventure and romance, which could mean anything from a weekend in wine country to a trip to Europe. As I folded clothes into my suitcase, I found myself thinking about the difference between this packing experience and that terrible night when I'd packed to leave Ryan. Then, every item had felt like a piece of myself I was losing, evidence of a life that had been a lie. Now, packing felt like preparation for another chapter in a story that kept getting better. David appeared in the doorway of our bedroom, holding 2 cups of coffee and grinning with barely contained excitement. "Ready for your surprise?" he asked. "I've been ready for weeks," I said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "The suspense is killing me." "Good," he said, pulling an envelope from his back pocket. "Open this." Inside were plane tickets to Iceland. Iceland, the destination I'd dreamed about for years, the place I'd wanted to visit to see the northern lights and the dramatic landscapes I'd only seen in photographs. "David," I breathed, staring at the tickets. "This is incredible." 2 weeks in Iceland," he said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "We're going to chase the northern lights, explore glaciers, soak in hot springs, and I'm going to photograph everything while you plan elaborate itineraries and get excited about every single thing we see." I started crying, happy tears that I didn't try to hide or apologize for. "I love that you cry when you're happy," David said, wiping my tears with his thumb. I love that you feel everything so deeply. I love that you're going to spend the entire flight researching hidden gems and creating backup plans for our backup plans. I love you, I said, kissing him with all the passion and intensity that had once been called too much. I love you too, he replied against my lips. Every overwhelming, beautiful, passionate part of you. As we held each other in our bedroom, surrounded by the life we'd built together, I thought about the woman I'd been 5 years ago, diminished, apologetic, convinced she was too much for anyone to truly love. That woman couldn't have imagined this life, this love, this perfect matching of souls who celebrated each other's intensity instead of diminishing it. Ryan had been wrong about me, but in the end, his wrongness had been the greatest gift, because it had forced me to leave, to rediscover myself, to find someone who didn't just tolerate my passion, but was inspired by it. I was never too much. I was just too much for him. And that, I realized, was the most beautiful difference of all. 10 years later, David and I were featured in a magazine article about couples who had built successful creative partnerships. The article included a photo of us in our home studio, him at his computer editing photos while I worked on campaign concepts at my drafting table, surrounded by the beautiful chaos of our creative lives. The interviewer asked us about the secret to our relationship's success. We celebrate each other's intensity, David said without hesitation. We don't try to tone each other down or ask each other to be less passionate. We fuel each other's fires instead of trying to extinguish them. And, I added, grinning at my husband, we learned early on that the right person doesn't make you feel like you're too much. They make you feel like you're exactly enough. The article ran with the headline, "When Too Much is Just Right, a Love Story." We framed it and hung it in our kitchen, right next to our wedding photo. The one where I'm laughing so hard I'm snorting while David looks at me like I'm the most wonderful thing he's ever seen. Because sometimes, the most beautiful love stories begin with someone telling you you're too much, and end with someone showing you that you're perfect exactly as you are.